St. Mary's Church in Willow Creek, Virginia, shimmered like a summer painting that morning. White roses twined around the old wooden archway. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering jewel-toned reflections onto the stone-tiled aisle. The soft strains of the organ floated in the air, blending with the murmurs of elegantly dressed guests. Today was the wedding of Emily Thompson, the mayor's daughter, and Daniel Carter, a rising young attorney. Nearly the whole town was there, except for the uninvited and those like Melissa Harper, who were only incidentally invited. Melissa, 28, sat quietly in the very last pew, tucked beside her 6-year-old daughter, Linda. Her pale blue cotton dress, clean and neatly pressed, still looked out of place among silk gowns and custom-tailored suits. Linda, in a hand-me-down floral dress, clutched her fabric doll, wide brown eyes taking in everything. Melissa smoothed down her daughter's messy brown curls, trying to stay calm even as her heart raced. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. Daniel, the groom, had been a regular at the cafe where Melissa worked. He always ordered his coffee black, tipped generously, and chatted with her about the weather, baseball, or how Linda loved to draw. A week ago, as Melissa wiped down a table, Daniel had said, "You should come to the wedding, Melissa. It'll be fun, and Linda would love the cake." There had been no invitation, just a warm gesture. Melissa agreed, partly because of Daniel's rare kindness, and partly because she wanted Linda to see something beautiful, something their everyday life rarely offered. But now, sitting among guarded smiles and sidelong glances, Melissa felt like she had stepped onto a stage she wasn't meant to be on. She lowered her head, pretending to adjust Linda's dress, hoping no one noticed them. Linda, unaware of her mother's tension, whispered, "Mom, the bride looks like a princess, right?" Melissa forced a smile and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. Very beautiful." The organ music faded as Father Michael stepped up to the altar to begin the ceremony. But before he could speak, a figure appeared in the aisle next to Melissa's pew. Catherine Thompson, the bride's mother, stood there in a pearl-colored gown, her hair perfectly pinned, eyes fixed coldly on Melissa and Linda. Her smile was tight, as if she'd just spotted a stain on an heirloom rug. She gave a subtle nod to a nearby usher, a middle-aged man in a dark suit holding a guest list. "Excuse me," the usher said quietly, bending down to Melissa, his voice polite but firm. "May I see your invitation?" Melissa felt heat flood her cheeks. She gripped Linda's hand and tried to keep her voice steady. I don't have one. Daniel, the groom, invited me personally." The usher frowned, glancing at the list. "Your name, please." "Melissa Harper," she said softly. People nearby had already started to turn, eyes filled with curiosity, judgment. A woman in pearls whispered to her neighbor, and Melissa caught fragments. "Waitress." "Inappropriate." The usher flipped through the list and shook his head. "I'm sorry, but you're not on here. And, the VIP section is full. Perhaps you should—" He trailed off, but the message was clear. "You don't belong here." Melissa swallowed hard, shame rising like a tide. She stood, pulling Linda with her, avoiding eye contact. "It's okay," she murmured, voice shaking. "We'll go." Linda, still clutching her doll, looked up, confused. "Mommy, did we do something wrong?" The question cut like a blade. Melissa knelt beside her, hugging her tightly. "No, sweetheart. We didn't do anything wrong. It's just a misunderstanding." But in her heart she knew it wasn't a mistake. It was the truth she tried to ignore. In Willow Creek, a single mom who lived in a cramped apartment and worked at a diner would always be an outsider. Catherine, standing just feet away, turned back to her circle of friends with a triumphant smile. Melissa heard the brittle laughter, sharp as shattered glass. She straightened, held Linda's hand tightly, and walked down the aisle, her spine stiff even as every part of her wanted to shrink away. The eyes followed them, as if she and her daughter were a stain on the picture-perfect canvas of the day. At the doors of the church, a breeze carried the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass. Linda tugged at her mother's hand, voice hopeful. "Mommy, where are we going now? Do we still get cake?" Melissa didn't answer right away. She looked down at her daughter, those bright eyes, that innocent smile, and reminded herself to stay strong, if only for Linda. "We're going home, honey," she said gently but firmly, "and I'll bake you a cake. Better than wedding cake." Linda nodded, though her eyes drifted back toward the church, where the organ music had resumed. Melissa tightened her grip on her daughter's hand and stepped through the arched gate. She didn't see the man in the gray suit watching from a few pews away, his gaze sharp yet conflicted. That man, Mason Whitaker, had seen everything, and soon he would change Melissa's life forever. But that's a story for another day. A light drizzle had begun to fall over the lawn of St. Mary's Church, the raindrops beating on blades of grass and shimmering faintly beneath the soft midday light. Melissa Harper clutched Linda's hand tightly, hurrying through the rose-draped archway, trying to keep her daughter from getting wet. The organ still echoed inside, a beautiful sound, but for them it was only a reminder of the rejection they just endured. Melissa bowed her head, her brown hair catching the rain, hiding the redness in her eyes. She didn't want Linda to see her cry. "Mommy, are we still getting cake?" Linda asked, her voice a hopeful whisper, tinged with worry. The fabric doll in her hand was damp along one side. Melissa forced a smile and knelt down to adjust her daughter's floral dress. "I'll make you a cake at home, sweetheart. Chocolate, your favorite." Linda nodded, though her eyes drifted back to the stained glass windows of the church that still shimmered in the distance. Just as they stepped past the gate, a little boy, about Linda's age and dressed in a tiny blue suit, ran up from a nearby gathering of guests. He looked at Linda with innocent curiosity and blurted out, "Hey, where's your dad? Why is it just your mom?" The question was childlike, but its impact was sharp. Linda froze, her wide eyes filling with tears. She clutched her doll tighter, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know." Melissa's heart cracked. She pulled Linda into her arms, holding her close. "It's okay, baby. You don't have to answer." But Linda began to cry, soft sobs lost in the patter of rain. Melissa stroked her daughter's hair, trying to keep her voice even, but inside she was reeling with shame and hurt. In Willow Creek, questions like that were never harmless. A single mother was always a subject of scrutiny, sometimes pity, sometimes scorn. Then a calm and steady voice rose from behind them. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" Melissa looked up to see a man in a charcoal gray suit walking toward them. He was well-dressed but unpretentious, in his mid-30s, with dark hair neatly combed, and eyes so deeply blue they seemed almost steel gray. His presence cut clean through the murmurs of the bystanders as he stepped in front of Melissa and Linda, shielding them from further stares. The church usher, the same one who had just politely ushered Melissa out, hurried forward, guest list still in hand. "Mr. Whitaker, sir, it's just a mix-up with the guest list. She wasn't on it, and seating is limited, so—" The man, Mason Whitaker, raised a hand to stop him. "She's my guest," he said calmly, but with an authority that ended the conversation. "I'll take care of it. Thank you." The usher hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. Whispers continued to ripple through the crowd, but Mason didn't acknowledge them. He turned to Melissa, his expression softening. "You don't have to leave in the rain like this. My car's nearby. Let me take you both somewhere dry." Melissa blinked, stunned. She didn't know this man, but his voice carried a kind of steady sincerity she couldn't bring herself to reject. "Thank you," she said quietly, "but we don't want to trouble you." "It's no trouble at all," Mason replied, then crouched slightly to address Linda, offering a warm smile. "Hey there, kiddo. Do you like hot chocolate? There's a little cafe nearby that makes the best one in town." Linda, still sniffling, gave a shy nod, her eyes glimmering again. Melissa squeezed her hand and nodded too, still wary, still unsure. Mason led them to a black SUV parked discreetly near the edge of the lot. He opened the rear door for Linda and then the front for Melissa, polite without being showy. Once everyone was settled and the engine purred to life, the rain drummed gently on the windshield. Inside, the car smelled faintly of leather and cedar, comforting somehow against the chill of the morning. On the drive to the cafe, Mason kept his tone light and directed his attention mostly to Linda. "So," he asked with a grin, "what's your doll's name?" "Her name's Daisy," Linda said, voice growing more confident. "I made her dress all by myself." Mason looked impressed, Really, that's amazing. I bet Daisy loves hot chocolate just as much as you do. Linda giggled, the first real laugh since leaving the church. Melissa watched quietly, taking in the man beside her. He wasn't just polite. He had a way of putting Linda at ease, something few strangers could manage. But why was he helping them? She bit her lip, then spoke. Mr. Whitaker. Right? I appreciate your kindness. But why did you help us? You don't know us. Mason glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes thoughtful. Call me Mason, he said. And why? I don't like watching people get humiliated, especially not in front of a child. He paused for a second, choosing his words. When I was a kid, I watched people treat my mother like she didn't belong. I've never forgotten how that felt. Melissa went quiet. His words touched something raw inside her. Years of being overlooked, whispered about, shut out. She thought of the supermarket glares, the whispered comments at school drop-off, the lonely feeling of trying to hold everything together. She nodded, voice soft. Thank you. Really? They arrived at a small cafe called Hazel's Brew, nestled in the center of town. The scent of cinnamon pastries and fresh coffee drifted out to meet them as they stepped inside. Linda let out a delighted squeal at the cozy wooden tables and steaming mugs lined up on the counter. Mason guided them to a window seat and ordered a hot chocolate for Linda, a coffee for Melissa, and a black coffee for himself. While Linda sipped and doodled on a napkin, Melissa turned to Mason. You were sitting in the front at the wedding, weren't you? A guest of the bride or groom? Mason shrugged, a faint, wistful smile on his lips. Wasn't really my place today, and I figured you and your daughter needed me more. He watched Linda with a gentle expression, then turned back to Melissa. You don't owe me anything. Just promise me you'll still make that chocolate cake for her, like you said you would. Melissa laughed, the sound light and genuine. Deal, she said, something warm stirring in her chest for the first time in days. What she didn't know, what none of them did, was that this moment, this small act of kindness in the rain, would mark the beginning of something far greater. Something that would change all their lives. Rain poured down on Willow Creek like a gray curtain, turning the dirt road leading to the outskirts into a string of muddy puddles. Inside Mason Whitaker's SUV, Melissa Harper sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as her eyes drifted over the blurred outlines of oak trees through the rain-speckled window. In the back seat, Linda hugged her fabric doll. Daisy, eyes wide with wonder as she watched the countryside roll by, occasionally squealing when a rabbit darted across the path. The sound of rain tapping steadily on the roof merged with the gentle twang of an old country song, playing on the radio, creating a strange sense of calm after the storm they had just left at St. Mary's Church. Mason drove carefully, glancing at Melissa in the rearview mirror. With rain like this, I didn't want you and Linda walking home, he said, his voice low but sincere. I've got a farm not far from here. You're welcome to wait out the storm there. It's more comfortable than a cafe booth. Melissa hesitated. She wasn't used to accepting help, especially not from a man she barely knew, even if he had just defended her in front of an entire church. But when she heard Linda yawn and saw her rub her eyes, she knew her daughter needed somewhere warm and dry. Thank you, she said softly but firmly. We won't stay long. Mason gave a small smile and focused back on the road. Minutes later, the SUV turned down a tree-lined lane and emerged at a hilltop farm nestled in a blanket of misty green. The main house was made of oak and stone, with deep red roof tiles and large windows that looked out onto open meadows. A small garden framed the home, filled with wildflowers and apple trees, charming and understated, not opulent, but deeply inviting. Melissa thought it didn't look like a millionaire's estate. It looked like a home with a soul. As the SUV pulled up to the front, an older woman stepped out from the doorway, holding an umbrella. Her gray hair was tied back neatly, and she wore a forest green sweater and jeans. Her smile was kind, cutting through the dampness in the air. Mason, you're home early, she said, her gaze drifting to Melissa and Linda, with gentle curiosity. And this is... Ruth, this is Melissa and Linda, Mason replied as he opened the back door for Linda. They'll be staying a while. Rain delay. Can you set up the guest room? Of course, Ruth nodded and waved Linda over. Hi there, sweetheart. You like cookies? I just baked a batch. Linda, still shy but intrigued, nodded. Her eyes brightened at the mention of cookies. Melissa managed a grateful smile, the tension in her chest loosening slightly. Ruth ushered them inside. The living room was spacious and warm, with a stone fireplace and bookshelves brimming with old novels. The air smelled of pine wood and fresh-baked cookies. Linda, still clutching Daisy, ran to the wide window and exclaimed, "Mommy, look! There's a rainbow!" Melissa joined her at the window, her heart softening at the sight of the pale arc stretched across the stormy sky. She gently smoothed Linda's damp curls, grateful that her daughter was smiling again. While Ruth prepared the guest room, Mason poured a cup of hot tea and handed it to Melissa. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice careful, as if afraid of overstepping. "I'm fine," Melissa replied, wrapping her hands around the cup. "Today just didn't go the way I hoped. I only wanted Linda to have a nice day." She glanced toward her daughter, who was now peering out into the garden. "This place, do you live here alone? It's beautiful." Mason nodded, a trace of melancholy in his eyes. "Mostly alone. Ruth's been here since I was a kid. The farm's been in my family forever, but I restored it after." He trailed off, fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup. "After an accident, a few years ago, someone I loved passed away." Melissa blinked, surprised by the openness. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been hard." Mason shrugged, the smile on his lips failing to mask the sadness behind his eyes. "I got used to it. Or at least, I've tried to." He changed the subject, voice softening. "I fund some community projects around Willow Creek. After-school programs, small grants. I stay out of the spotlight, though. Maybe that's what you and I had in common today. Not belonging in that church." Melissa chuckled lightly for the first time in hours. "Maybe, but you've done so much. I'm just trying to raise Linda, one day at a time." She looked out at her daughter, who was chasing butterflies across the garden despite the light drizzle. "Don't say that like it's small," Mason replied. "Raising someone like her, it's no small thing. You're doing better than you think." He stood and nodded toward the door. "Want to go outside with her? The garden's prettiest in the rain." Melissa nodded, and together Mason, Melissa, and Linda stepped into the garden under the dripping apple trees. Linda delighted in picking wildflowers, chatting about Daisy and how she wanted to be an artist someday. Mason listened closely, asking questions that made her giggle. Melissa watched, realizing he wasn't just kind. He made people feel seen, even while carrying pain of his own. As dusk settled over the hills, Ruth called everyone in for dinner: pumpkin soup, warm bread, and apple cookies. Linda, tired after a long day, nearly fell asleep at the table. Ruth guided her upstairs to a cozy guest room where a folding bed had been prepared with lavender-scented sheets. Linda hugged Melissa tightly and murmured, "Mommy, this place feels like Grandma's house." Then she drifted off, peaceful in a way Melissa rarely saw in their cramped apartment. Melissa stayed beside her for a while, brushing hair from her forehead. Her heart ached and eased at the same time. When she returned to the living room, she found Mason standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. "She asleep?" he asked, not turning around. "Like a rock," Melissa replied. "Thank you, Mason, not just for today, for everything. Linda doesn't get this kind of peace very often." Mason nodded, still watching the fire. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what felt right." He glanced at her briefly, offering a small smile. "Get some rest. The rain should stop by morning. I'll drive you both home." Melissa nodded and turned toward the guest room. But even as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that this farm, and the man by the fire, had just opened a door to something she never dared hope for. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the window of Mason Whitaker's small library, casting golden stripes across the gleaming hardwood floor. The space wasn't large, but every inch of it glowed with the warmth of time. Shelves lined with well-worn books, a fabric armchair faded with age beside the stone fireplace, and a scattering of quiet relics on the wooden desk: a pocket watch, a dusty photo frame, and a tin box filled with sharpened pencils. Melissa Harper stood in the center of the room, a cloth in hand, momentarily caught in the scent of old paper and pine. She had agreed to help Ruth with the morning cleaning, partly to show her gratitude, and partly to distract herself from the sting of the previous day at St. Mary's. Ruth, her silver hair neatly tied back and arms full of fresh towels, stepped into the room with her usual gentle smile. "You don't have to do too much, dear," she said as she placed the towels on the desk. "Just dust the shelves and maybe straighten a few books. No one really comes in here anymore. Not since—" She paused, her voice trailing off into memory. "Well, take your time." Melissa nodded, respecting the pause, but sensing that Ruth had just stepped around something delicate, she began carefully wiping down the shelves. Cautious not to disturb the old novels or architectural volumes Mason clearly cherished. On a small rug near the window, Linda sat cross-legged, humming a song as she drew with colored pencils Ruth had found for her. "Mommy, can I draw a picture for Mr. Mason?" she asked, her white eyes gleaming. "Of course, sweetheart," Melissa smiled, brushing her daughter's hair from her forehead. "I think he'd love that." It warmed her to see Linda so carefree, untouched by yesterday's cruel whispers at the church. This house, this land, it was offering her daughter something rare and precious: peace. As Melissa worked her way to the lower shelves, her cloth brushed against a slim, leather-bound notebook, wedged between two large hardcovers. Curious, she pulled it free. The leather was cracked and soft, bound shut with a faded blue ribbon. When she untied it, a rush of time seemed to exhale from the yellowed pages. The first page read, "Sarah, 2020. Melissa froze. Sarah, the name Mason had spoken the night before. His late fiancée. She knew she shouldn't read further, but something in her, something both respectful and deeply human, compelled her to turn the page. "Today Mason took me to Shenandoah Valley. He said he wanted to build us a little house there, with a garden full of wildflowers. I dreamed of a family, a child, maybe a little girl with his laugh. Is it foolish to dream of things that may never come true?" Melissa's breath caught. The words were tender and aching, a mirror of her own past hopes. Dreams she had held before her life unraveled, before her daughter became her whole world. She had dreamed of a home too once, a family, peace. She gently closed the journal, fingers trembling. Behind her, footsteps creaked softly on the floor. Melissa turned to find Ruth standing in the doorway, her expression kind but knowing. "You found Sarah's journal," Ruth said quietly. Melissa's face flushed. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," Ruth said, stepping into the room and settling into the old armchair. "Maybe it was meant to be read, at least by someone who might understand." She let out a sigh, her eyes drifting toward the window. Sarah was Mason's light. They met in architecture school. Fell in love fast and real. 4 years ago, she died in a car accident. Mason was with her until the end, but he never forgave himself. He always believed if he had been the one driving that day, it might have been different. Melissa sat on the edge of the hearth, clutching the journal to her chest. "That's why he lives out here, alone?" she asked, her voice low. Ruth nodded. "He left the company, came back here, started funding local projects, quietly without ever attaching his name. I think he was trying to give something back, trying to prove he wasn't useless. But his heart, he closed it off." Melissa looked at the worn leather cover in her hands, and for the first time, she saw Mason clearly, not as a wealthy benefactor or mysterious stranger, but as a man carrying deep scars. His kindness at the church, his steady presence at the cafe, these weren't passing gestures. They were threads of a man rebuilding something broken. "Mr. Mason, look!" Linda's voice cut through the moment. She scampered across the rug, waving a colorful drawing. Mason had just entered the room. "I made this for you," she said brightly, holding up her picture. It was a crayon sketch of a hilltop house with 3 people in front. A tall man, a woman with brown hair, and a little girl holding a doll. "That's you, Mommy, and me," Linda beamed. Mason blinked, momentarily stunned, then knelt to her level. "You drew this?" he asked, voice softer than Melissa had ever heard it. Linda nodded, hugging the paper. "Do you like it?" I love it, he said, his smile real, deep and warm. Can I keep it? Linda nodded again and threw her arms around his neck. Mason held her, gently, a quiet look of wonder on his face. Melissa watched from where she sat, her heart stirred. Something invisible shifted in the room, a thread, maybe, forming between the man who had lost a future and the child who had never known a father. She rose slowly and walked over to the shelf. Carefully she returned Sarah's journal to its place, letting it rest undisturbed. She had seen enough. Enough to understand that Mason's wounds were real, that his silence wasn't distance, it was pain, and his kindness, so freely given, came from a place of loss. Maybe, just maybe, she and Linda hadn't stumbled into this farm by accident. Maybe this place, this man, held the beginnings of something they hadn't dared to believe in again. Healing. Summer sunlight flooded Mason Whitaker's farm garden, gilding the rows of wildflowers in the dewy apple tree leaves. A light breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and warm earth, bringing life to the lush green hillside on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Melissa Harper stood in the garden, holding a small pair of pruning shears, trimming back the overgrown rose bushes. Her cotton shirt fluttered in the wind, and for the first time in many months, she felt a quiet peace creeping into her heart. Just a few steps away, Linda was chasing a butterfly, her clear laughter echoing like a melody. It had been 2 weeks since Melissa and her daughter arrived at the farm, after the rain and the incident at St. Mary's Church. What began as a temporary shelter had become a part of their life. With quiet sincerity, Mason had offered for them to stay until Melissa found a more stable job. She had agreed, not just because their cramped apartment was no place she wanted Linda to grow up, but because this farm, with its garden and warm meals, seemed to be healing wounds she hadn't even realized she carried. That morning Melissa helped Mrs. Ruth tend the garden. A simple task, but one that made her feel useful. She weeded, watered the plants, and chatted with Mrs. Ruth about everyday things. Weather, apple jam recipes, or how Linda loved to draw everything she saw. Meanwhile, Linda sat under an apple tree with her notebook and crayons, humming as she sketched. Melissa watched her daughter, her heart heavy with love. Linda laughed more, slept better, and her eyes lit up every time she talked about the farm. The sound of footsteps on grass made Melissa look up. Mason stepped out of the house, wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, carrying a tray of lemonade. He set the tray on the wooden table in the garden and smiled at Linda. "Sweetheart, want to try playing the piano? I've got an old song I think you'll like." Linda dropped her notebook and squealed, "Yes!" She ran after Mason into the living room, where an old wooden piano stood by the large window. Melissa followed, curious. In the living room, sunlight filtered through the linen curtains, illuminating the time-worn piano keys. Mason sat down, letting his fingers glide over the keys, playing a slow, gentle tune, like a lullaby. "I wrote this back when I was young," he said, eyes on Linda. "Want to try?" Linda nodded, climbed onto the bench, and Mason patiently showed her how to place her hands, how to press each note. Linda's clumsy notes blended with their laughter, creating a moment Melissa couldn't look away from. She sat on the sofa and listened. Mason's music, though simple, carried a deep sadness, as if he was weaving memories of Sarah into each note. Melissa thought of the journal she found in the library, the lines about Sarah's dreams of family. She looked at Mason, a man who always appeared calm, but whose eyes, when he taught Linda, revealed a tenderness she'd never seen before. That afternoon, the three of them had lunch in the garden. Mrs. Ruth's homemade sandwiches, fresh garden salad, and chilled lemonade. Linda told Mason about her doll, Daisy, saying it wanted to be an artist like her. Mason listened, teasing her now and then, making Linda giggle. Melissa watched, realizing the bond between the three of them was quietly growing in these ordinary moments. Having breakfast together, reading books to Linda, or simply sitting in the sunlight, listening to a child's story. After lunch, as Linda ran off to pick wildflowers, Mason turned to Melissa, his voice low. "Have you ever thought about teaching?" he asked. "I fund a community center in town. They offer literacy classes for underprivileged kids. They need someone like you, patient, good with children." Melissa blinked, surprised. I've never taught formally. I just teach Linda at home, and I dropped out of college because—" She trailed off, not wanting to bring up the husband who had left her. "I mean, I'm not sure I'm good enough." "Good enough," Mason repeated, his gaze sincere. "I've seen the way you teach Linda. You have a gift, Melissa, and the center needs people like you. Just a few hours a week, if you want to give it a try." Melissa was silent, weighing the idea. The thought of doing something meaningful, of feeling valuable, made her heart race. She nodded and smiled. "All right, I'll try. Thank you, Mason." He nodded, though his eyes drifted off into the distance. "Don't thank me, I just wanted to help." He stood and walked into the house, leaving Melissa with the feeling that he was holding back something invisible. She didn't know that, in Mason's heart, every moment with her and Linda was a quiet battle. He loved the way Linda laughed, the way Melissa cared for her. But he feared that if he allowed himself to get closer, he might lose the memory of Sarah, the woman he once promised to love forever. That evening, Melissa sat beside Linda in bed, reading a fairy tale. Linda yawned and whispered, "Mommy, Mr. Mason is nice, isn't he? He reminds me of Grandpa." Melissa smiled, brushing her daughter's hair. "Yes, he's very kind. Now go to sleep, sweetheart." But as Linda drifted off, Melissa looked out the window, where the moonlight shone over the garden. She thought of Mason, of the community center, and of herself, a single mother who once thought she had nothing left but Linda. At this farm she was starting to believe she could do more, and for the first time, she dared to hope for the days ahead. The Willow Creek Community Center, a modest red brick building nestled in the heart of the town square, buzzed with children's laughter on Saturday morning. Summer sunlight streamed through the tall windows, lighting up chalkboards covered with letters and numbers. Melissa Harper stood at the front of a small group of elementary students, pointing at the board, her voice gentle but steady. "Okay, who can read this word? Sunshine." A shy girl raised her hand and read it out loud. Melissa smiled and clapped encouragingly. "Great job, Emma." The literacy class, funded by Mason Whitaker, had become an unexpected joy for Melissa over the past 3 weeks. The children, many from underprivileged families, adored her for her patience and the stories she told during breaks. Some parents, once hesitant, had started bringing her cookies or coffee to show appreciation. Melissa felt that a part of herself, buried after years of being a single mother, was coming alive again. She was starting to believe she could do something meaningful, not just for Linda, but for all of Willow Creek. But not everyone in town looked at her with warmth. After class, Melissa took Linda to Hazel's Brew for a hot chocolate. The small cafe was packed, the air rich with the scent of cinnamon waffles and coffee. Linda sat at a corner table, doodling, while Melissa stood in line. At the counter, she overheard 2 women talking nearby, their voices just loud enough that she couldn't pretend not to hear. "That's her, the one staying at Mason Whitaker's farm." One woman wearing a silk scarf whispered to her friend, "Used to be a waitress at that cafe, single mom, now she's climbing up thanks to Mason. Who would have guessed?" The other woman chuckled, her eyes drifting toward Melissa. "Does she really think she belongs with someone like him? Mason's a millionaire, and she didn't even finish college. I heard her husband left because she wasn't good enough." Melissa felt the blood rush to her face, as if she'd been slapped. She lowered her gaze, pretending to study the menu, but the words stung like knives. She knew this town, where people smiled to your face and whispered behind your back. She had once been shunned for being a single mom, the judging stares at the grocery store, the church invitations that never came. But she had hoped that the class, Mason's kindness, meant things could be different. Now she realized she had been naive. On the ride back to the farm, Linda held her mother's hand, chattering happily about a drawing she'd made. Melissa only nodded, her mind spinning. The whispers had reopened wounds she'd tried to bury. She was a failed single mother, abandoned by her husband, not good enough for someone like Mason. She looked at Linda, carefree and glowing with joy, and wondered if staying at the farm had been a mistake. Not just for her, but for Linda too, who would grow up hearing those whispers. That night in the warm guest room Ruth had prepared, Melissa sat at the desk and wrote a letter. Her hand trembled on the paper, but she forced herself to stay firm. "Mason, Ruth, I don't know how to thank you both for your kindness. This farm has given Linda and me the most peaceful days we've had in years. But I can't stay. I need to stand on my own feet. For Linda, and for myself. Thank you for everything, Melissa. She folded the letter and left it on the table, then quietly packed a few clothes into a bag. Linda, already fast asleep, stirred slightly as Melissa lifted her into the taxi she had called earlier. But as they stepped into the yard, the porch light flicked on, and Mason appeared in the doorway, a jacket hastily thrown over his shoulders. Melissa, what's going on? He asked, concern etched in his voice. He looked at Linda, rubbing her eyes in her mother's arms, then at the bag. Where are you going in the middle of the night? Melissa clutched Linda tighter, her voice shaking but firm. We have to go, Mason. Thank you for everything. But Anna, I don't belong here. She turned away, not wanting him to see her teary eyes. Linda, still drowsy, suddenly broke free from her mother's arms and ran to Mason, wrapping her arms around his leg. Uncle Mason, don't let us go, she cried, her voice cracking. I want you to stay with us forever. Her words hit Melissa like a blade. She froze, then knelt and pulled her daughter close, unable to hold back the tears. Mason knelt beside Linda, stroking her hair, his voice rough with emotion. I want that too, sweetheart. But your mom has made up her mind. He looked up at Melissa, pain flickering in his eyes. If this is what you want, I won't stop you. But at least let me drive you. Don't take a taxi this late. Melissa nodded silently, too drained to argue. In the car, no one spoke. Only Linda sniffled quietly. When they reached the old apartment complex on the edge of town, Mason helped carry the bag but stopped at the door. Melissa, he said, his voice hoarse. I don't know what I did wrong, but if I made you feel disrespected, I'm sorry. Melissa shook her head, tears falling freely. It's not you, Mason, it's me. I can't live with the whispers. She turned away and shut the door, leaving Mason alone in the dark. Back at the quiet farm, Mason returned and found the letter on the table. He read it slowly, his hand tightening around the paper. Ruth stood in the doorway, sighing. You're really letting her go, Mason. That woman and her little girl. They're the best thing that's ever happened to you. Mason didn't respond, but inside him a storm was raging. He realized he'd never said it out loud. Not pity, but the growing admiration and affection he had for Melissa and Linda. He had kept his distance, afraid of losing the memory of Sarah. But now, without Linda's laughter echoing through the house, he knew he couldn't let fear rob him of happiness again. Are you still following the story? Please leave your thoughts on the story in the comments below. All your comments are the motivation for us to create better stories. Don't forget to subscribe to Soul Stories. Thank you very much. Mason Whitaker's farm, once filled with Linda's laughter and Melissa's everyday stories, now sank into a heavy silence. Pale moonlight streamed through the living room window, casting a glow over the worn piano keys where Linda had once practiced clumsy notes. Mason sat in the armchair, holding the letter Melissa had left behind, reading the neat lines over and over. I need to stand on my own 2 feet, for Linda and for myself. Each word felt like a blade, reminding him of that moment he stood frozen at the rundown apartment complex, watching the mother and daughter disappear behind a cracked wooden door. Ruth entered carrying a tray of tea, her sharp eyes clouded with worry. She set the tray down without a word, looking at Mason with silent reproach. At last she spoke, her voice low but firm. You really let them go, Mason. Melissa and Linda were the best thing to happen to this farm. To you. Why do you keep letting your fear stop you from being happy? Mason clenched the letter tighter, not looking up. You don't understand, Ruth, he said hoarsely. I lost Sarah. I don't want to lose anyone else. If I let myself get close, and something happens, what then? Ruth sat across from him, her gaze softening but uncompromising. You didn't lose them to fate or some tragic accident, Mason. You lost them because you didn't say what you felt. Melissa didn't leave because she didn't need you. She left because she thought she didn't belong here, and you did nothing to show her otherwise. Her words hit like a blow, and Mason sat stunned. He thought of the days on the farm, Linda singing in the garden, the way Melissa smiled while teaching her daughter. the light in her eyes when she spoke about the literacy class. He had kept his distance, thinking it was the way to protect Sarah's memory. But now he saw. He had pushed Melissa and Linda away, left them alone to face the town's cruel whispers. The next morning, Mason drove to the apartment complex on the edge of Willow Creek. A row of low, peeling buildings with small yards overgrown with weeds. The sky was bright, but the air here felt heavy, burdened with the struggles of its residents. He parked outside Melissa's unit, heart pounding. Through the window he saw Linda at the table drawing, while Melissa, dressed in a waitress uniform, tied her hair back before heading to work. He knocked on the door. When Melissa opened it, her eyes flickered with surprise before settling into guarded calm. "Mason," she said, voice even but cool. "What are you doing here?" Before he could answer, Linda looked up, her eyes lighting up. "Uncle Mason," she cried, leaping from her seat and wrapping her arms around his legs, hugging him tightly like she was afraid he might vanish. "Uncle Mason, I missed you. You came to take us back to the farm, right?" Mason knelt, holding Linda close, his heart aching. "I missed you too, sweetheart," he said, brushing her hair. He looked at Melissa, her expression still distant, though her hands trembled slightly as she held Linda's shoulders. "Linda, go inside, honey," Melissa said gently but firmly. Linda hesitated, then ran in, leaving the adults in the soft morning light. Melissa folded her arms. "If you're here to convince me, don't bother. I've made up my mind. I need to make it on my own." Mason took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Melissa, I didn't come to convince you. I came to apologize." He stepped closer, his voice low and sincere. "I didn't help you and Linda out of pity. You gave me a reason to live again, to feel like that farm was more than just a place I was hiding in. But I never made that clear. I let you think you didn't matter. That was my failure." Melissa blinked, surprised by his honesty. She turned away, glancing through the window at Linda drawing again. "You don't understand," she said, voice shaky. "This town. They said I was reaching above my place, that I wasn't good enough for you. I can't raise Linda in that. I grew up with those whispers. I won't let her do the same. I have to prove I'm good enough, not just to them, but to myself." Mason nodded, his eyes pained but resolute. "I understand, but you don't need to leave to prove that. You already have, with your class, with the way you raise Linda. You're stronger than you know, Melissa. And if you're willing, I want you to come back to the farm. Not as a guest, but as the leader of a new community project I'm launching. A class for women like you, women who need a second chance." Melissa was quiet, considering. She thought of the days at the farm, Linda's laughter, the way Mason looked when he taught her piano. She thought of this cramped apartment, the aching hands from night shifts at the diner, just to cover rent. The idea of doing something bigger, for herself, for others, made her heart beat faster. "All right," she said finally, her voice soft but sure. "But not because I need your help, Mason, because I want to do this, for Linda, and for other women like me." Mason smiled for the first time that day, a look of quiet relief. "I respect that," he said, "and I promise, I'll never let you feel like you don't belong again." From inside, Linda had been eavesdropping. She came running out and hugged them both. "Mommy, Uncle Mason, we're going back to the farm, right?" She beamed. Melissa laughed, eyes glistening. "Yes, baby, we're going back." On the drive home, Linda sang in the back seat, while Mason and Melissa sat in silence. Not the silence of strangers, but of understanding. Mason looked at the road ahead, knowing he still had fears to conquer, but this time he wouldn't let them hold him back. The farm, with its garden and Linda's laughter, would be full of life again. And for the first time, he dared to hope for a future that wasn't just a memory. The Willow Creek Community Center was buzzing with chatter and the scent of freshly baked cookies on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Brightly colored boards displayed slogans like, "Learn to shine," and "Grow together." Melissa Harper stood in the center of the large room, wearing a pale blue shirt and jeans, guiding a group of women, single mothers, women who had lost their jobs, or simply those looking for a fresh start. She pointed to the whiteboard, her voice warm but confident. "Today we'll write a short paragraph about your dreams. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be yours. The class for single mothers, sponsored by Mason Whitaker and funded in part by St. Mary's Church, had become the heart of the town over the past 2 months. Melissa, with the help of Mrs. Helen, a retired black elementary school teacher with more than 3 decades of experience, had turned the class into a safe space, where students didn't just learn literacy skills but also share their personal stories. Mrs. Helen, with her salt and pepper hair and radiant smile, sat in a corner helping a student complete her assignment. Her voice rang out like a song. "You're doing great, Mary. Now let's try one more sentence, shall we?" Melissa looked around, her heart full of satisfaction. She remembered the days in that run-down apartment when she thought she had nothing but Linda. Now she stood here, leading a program that wasn't just changing the lives of these women, it was helping her rediscover herself. Near the window, Linda was drawing with a few other children, occasionally glancing up to smile at her mother. Melissa smiled back, knowing she was building a better future for her daughter. After class, Melissa and Mrs. Helen stayed behind to tidy up and discuss plans to expand the program in the fall. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," Mrs. Helen said, her eyes sparkling. "You're not afraid of hard things and you put your heart into everything you do. This town is lucky to have you." Melissa blushed and shook her head. "No, I'm the lucky one, for having you here." The next day, Mason arrived at the center wearing a gray t-shirt and carrying a folder. "I want to take you to the church," he said, his voice calm but enthusiastic. "The board wants to hear about the project. I think we can propose an expansion, more classes, maybe even a support fund for women learning new trades." Melissa blinked, surprised by the scale of the idea, but nodded, confidence growing inside her. At St. Mary's Church, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting dappled patterns over the wooden pews. Father Michael, a tall, lean man with silver hair, welcomed them into his modest office. Sitting beside him were 2 board members, and, to Melissa's surprise, Mrs. Catherine Thompson, the mother of the bride from the wedding where Melissa had once been, politely asked to leave. Her heart raced, but she kept her posture upright and held the folder Mason had handed her firmly. Mason began, his voice clear. "Melissa's program has helped over 20 women in town, and we believe it can do even more. With the church's support, we'd like to expand the classes and create a scholarship fund." He looked at Melissa, giving her the floor. Melissa took a deep breath and outlined the plan: writing classes, financial literacy, emotional support, all aimed at helping women become more independent. She spoke of the students: Mary, who had just landed a part-time job after learning how to write a resume, and Laura, who had rediscovered hope after years of abuse. Her voice wavered at first but grew steadier with each word, as if all the fear of judgment had melted away. Father Michael nodded thoughtfully. When Melissa finished, he smiled warmly. "Ms. Harper, I must admit, this church didn't treat you fairly in the past. For that, I'm sorry. But what you've done proves that you're an essential part of Willow Creek. The church will support your project." Mrs. Catherine, who had remained silent throughout, gave a small nod. Her gaze no longer carried the coldness it once did. Melissa left the church feeling relieved, and still a little stunned. Mason walked beside her, smiling. "You did great," he said. "They didn't just say yes, they want you to lead the whole program." Melissa laughed and shook her head. "I didn't do it alone. You, Mrs. Helen, Father Michael, you all helped." That weekend, the community center held a small celebration to mark the expansion of the project. A long table covered in a white cloth was lined with pastries and fruit juice. Kids ran through the courtyard, and Melissa's students proudly displayed their writing. Linda, wearing a new floral dress, held up a small sign that read, "Welcome everyone," drawing laughter and applause from the crowd. In the middle of the event, Melissa was surprised to see Mrs. Catherine Thompson approaching, holding a hardcover children's book, a story about butterflies. She handed it to Linda, her voice soft. "I heard you like drawing butterflies, Linda. I thought you might enjoy this." Linda squealed in delight, hugged the book, then wrapped her arms around Mrs. Catherine, making the woman flush with surprise, but smile nonetheless. Melissa stood nearby, stunned. Mrs. Catherine hadn't apologized aloud, but in Willow Creek's quiet, traditional culture, This small gesture was its own kind of confession. As the event drew to a close, Melissa stood outside, watching people talk and laugh. Mrs. Helen patted her on the shoulder and said, "You've done something this town really needed, Melissa. You brought people closer together." Melissa smiled, watching Linda run with her friends, then glanced over at Mason, who was helping fold up tables. She was no longer the woman on the last pew of St. Mary's. She was Melissa Harper, the woman who had found her voice, and through it, helped her community rediscover its heart. The summer sunset cast a golden-orange glow over Mason Whitaker's garden, bathing the wildflowers in dew-speckled apple leaves in warm light. A soft breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming roses, creating a peaceful, almost storybook atmosphere. Melissa Harper sat on a wooden bench in the garden, holding a warm cup of tea, her eyes drifting to Linda, who was laughing as she chased a butterfly through the flower beds. The farm, with its sunlit days and birdsong, had become a second home to mother and daughter, a place where old wounds were slowly healing. Mason emerged from the house holding a folder of sheet music. He wore a simple white linen shirt, his dark hair slightly tousled by the breeze. He paused, watching Linda with a quiet smile, then walked over and sat beside Melissa. "That girl never runs out of energy," he said, his deep voice warm, his gaze still following Linda. Melissa chuckled, setting her tea down. "Sometimes I wish I had half her energy. She loves this place, Mason. She calls it her Butterfly Kingdom." She looked at him, a mixture of gratitude and something newer, something harder to name. Over the past weeks, through community classes, shared meals, and the way Mason patiently played piano with Linda, she had come to see him not just as the man who helped her at the church, but as someone she wanted to truly understand. Mason handed her the folder, his fingers brushing lightly across the cover. "I wrote this for Linda," he said, his voice slightly hesitant. "It's a short piece, inspired by the little tune she's always humming. I guess you and Linda helped me believe in love again." He looked at her, his deep blue eyes filled with sincerity and a trace of fear, as if he worried he'd said too much. Melissa took the folder, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the title. Linda's Lullaby. The handwritten notes were soft, like a lullaby, and made her heart beat faster. She thought of Sarah's journal, of dreams about family, and realized that Mason, who had locked his heart away after such a loss, was now opening it to her and Linda. "Mason, this is beautiful," she said softly. "Linda's going to love it, and I don't even know how to thank you." "Don't thank me," Mason replied, his gaze gentle. "I'm the one who should be thanking you. You and Linda brought light back into this place, into my life. After Sarah, I didn't think I'd ever feel this again. But you make me want to try." Melissa was quiet. His words touched something deep inside her. She looked out over the garden, where Linda was gathering wildflower petals, then took a deep breath and finally shared something she'd always kept hidden. "I used to think I didn't deserve love," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "When Linda was just a year old, her father left. He said I wasn't good enough, that I was holding him back, and I believed it, Mason. I worked day and night to raise Linda, but I always felt like I wasn't enough. When people in town started whispering, it reminded me of his words, and I got scared. Scared that Linda would grow up with a mother who wasn't strong enough." Mason listened without interrupting, his eyes full of understanding. When she paused, he gently took her hand, his grip warm and steady. "Melissa, you are not lacking," he said, his voice firm. "You're the strongest person I've ever met. The way you've raised Linda, the way you stood tall at the community center, that's not something just anyone can do. You deserve every good thing, and I want to be part of that, if you'll let me." Melissa blinked, tears glimmering in her eyes, but she smiled. She gave his hand a small squeeze, the fear that had once held her back slowly melting away. "I want that too," she whispered. "But I'm scared, Mason. Scared I won't be enough, or that this won't last." "We're all scared," Mason said, pulling her gently into a hug. "But I'd rather be scared and try than let you and Linda walk away again." They embraced in the fading sunlight, the breeze mingling with the soft piano melody Mason had played earlier, still echoing from the living room. From across the yard, Linda ran over holding a new drawing, unaware of the moment unfolding. She held it up excitedly. "Mom, Mr. Mason, look, I drew our family." The picture showed 3 figures in front of the farmhouse: a tall man, a woman, and a little girl holding a doll, surrounded by colorful butterflies. "I want you and Mr. Mason to get married, so we can stay here forever," she declared. Melissa laughed, blushing, while Mason pretended to cough, his smile radiant. "Well, young lady, you sure know how to make things interesting," he said, lifting Linda into his arms as she giggled. "But I think your mom needs a little more time to decide on such a big thing." He glanced at Melissa, his look teasing but warm. Melissa brushed Linda's hair back and hugged her close. "Linda, no matter what, Mr. Mason and I will always be here for you," she said gently. Linda nodded content and ran off to play again, leaving the 2 adults standing together in the golden light. They sat back down on the bench shoulder to shoulder, no words needed. The sound of the piano, now played softly by Mrs. Ruth, floated through the window like a gentle reminder of the days they had shared on the farm. Melissa looked at Mason and for the first time in years, felt true peace. She was no longer the insecure single mother, and Mason was no longer the man hiding from the past. They were building something new, not to replace what had been lost, but to cherish what they now had. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving a sky full of stars, Mason took Melissa's hand and whispered, "Thank you for giving me a chance." Melissa smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for giving me a home." St. Mary's Church in Willow Creek, Virginia, basked in the warm glow of June sunlight that morning. Rays filtered through stained glass windows, casting patches of green, red, and gold across the stone aisle. Simple white wildflowers, picked from Mason Whitaker's own garden, were tied around the wooden pews, creating an atmosphere both rustic and elegant. There was none of the extravagance of the mayor's daughter's wedding the year before, but today felt warmer, more genuine, as if the entire town had gathered to bless a new beginning. It was the wedding day of Melissa Harper and Mason Whitaker, a day Willow Creek would long remember. Melissa stood in a small room behind the church, wearing a simple white wedding dress, delicate lace sleeves wrapped around her shoulders, and the hem of her gown brushed the wooden floor. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, her brown hair loosely tied back with sprigs of wildflowers tucked in. She smiled, not the nervous smile of a bride seeking perfection, but the calm smile of a woman who had found peace after a long storm. Linda, in a soft pink floral dress, stood beside her, holding a basket of fresh petals, bouncing on her toes. "Mommy, you look like a princess," she squealed, her wide eyes sparkling. Melissa knelt and hugged her tightly, brushing back her messy curls. "Thank you, my sweet girl," she whispered, tears shimmering in her eyes. "And today you're the most beautiful little flower girl." Linda giggled, gave her mother a tight squeeze, and dashed toward the door, eager to begin the ceremony. Outside, the church was filled, not with lavish VIPs, but with familiar faces from Willow Creek. Mrs. Helen, the retired African-American school teacher, who had supported Melissa's work at the community center, sat in the front row wearing a violet dress, her smile radiant. Melissa's students, Mary Laura and many other women, chatted quietly, proud of the woman who had helped them reclaim their voices. Even Mrs. Catherine Thompson, once cold and dismissive when Melissa was asked to leave a wedding, was there, wearing a pale blue silk dress, her expression softer than ever. The organ began to play a gentle, slow melody, Linda's lullaby, written by Mason himself and performed by a friend. Linda entered first, scattering white rose petals down the aisle, each step a playful dance. The guest chuckled when she paused to wave at Mrs. Helen, making the whole church light up with joy. Melissa, arm in arm with Ruth, who had become like a mother to her, followed, her heart racing not with fear, but with joy. Mason stood at the altar in a dark gray suit, his black hair neatly combed, his eyes lighting up as he watched Melissa approach. He didn't hide his smile, an honest, heartfelt smile, as if every sorrow in his past had melted away in this moment. When she reached him, he took her hand and whispered, "You're more beautiful than I ever dreamed." Melissa blushed, gripping his hand gently, feeling as if the entire world had disappeared, except for the two of them. Father Michael stepped up to the pulpit, his voice warm and steady in the quiet sanctuary. Today we witness a family built on trust and forgiveness, he began. Melissa and Mason have overcome trials, not just to find one another, but to bring us, the Willow Creek community, closer together. Today we bless not only their love, but the power of grace and hope. Many guests wiped away tears. Mrs. Catherine bowed her head, her hand clutching a handkerchief, perhaps remembering her past mistakes. Mrs. Helen nodded proudly at Melissa, her eyes glowing. Linda, standing beside her mother, looked around wide-eyed, not grasping every word but sensing the joy in the air. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Mason and Melissa exchanged vows, their voices shaky yet sure. I promise to love and cherish you, Melissa, and Linda as my family through sunshine and storms, Mason said, never breaking eye contact. Melissa replied, tears rolling down her cheeks. I promise to stand beside you, Mason, and build a home full of love, for us and for Linda. They exchanged silver rings etched with tiny wildflowers, symbols of the garden that had brought them together. When Father Michael declared them husband and wife, Mason gently kissed Melissa, a soft but deeply emotional kiss. Linda clapped and jumped up and down, making the whole church laugh. Guests applauded as the couple walked back down the aisle, wildflowers tossed in the air by the children from Melissa's class, creating a dazzling scene in the sunlight. The reception took place at the farm, in their beloved garden. Long wooden tables draped with white linen held homemade pastries, apple preserves, and cold lemonade. Children ran and played while adults mingled, the music of a local country band filling the warm air. Mrs. Helen led a group of students in presenting Melissa with a notebook filled with letters of thanks. You changed our lives, Mary said, hugging Melissa. Today is your day, but it's ours too. Even Mrs. Catherine, still composed but more open, approached Melissa. You've done something wonderful for this town, Melissa, she said sincerely. I'm grateful to be here today. Melissa smiled and nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. That means a lot. There was no formal apology, but in Willow Creek, presence and words like these were enough to heal old wounds. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Melissa led Mason to a small corner of the garden she had tended herself. A bed of daisies, lavender, and wild roses surrounded a wooden plaque that read, Sarah's Garden. I wanted to do this, Melissa said softly, to honor Sarah. She was an important part of your life. I hope it's okay. Mason stared at the plaque, eyes glistening. He pulled Melissa into his arms and whispered, You're not replacing anyone, Melissa. You and Linda are the miracle I never dared to dream of. Thank you for making me a better man. They stood together, holding each other, as the breeze whispered through the garden, carrying blessings from the past and hope for the future. The final scene, Linda ran through the garden, holding a butterfly-shaped kite Mason had made for her. Her laughter echoed, mingling with the soft music from the band. Melissa and Mason stood side by side, hands entwined, watching her. We did it, didn't we? Melissa asked, resting her head on his shoulder. Mason kissed her forehead, smiling. Yes, we did. And this is only the beginning. They looked out toward the horizon, where the last golden rays of sunlight still shimmered, knowing that whatever the future held, they would face it together as a real family.